In 1960, South Korea's per capita income was $79. That put it below Haiti, Ethiopia, and Yemen, among the poorest nations on Earth. People scoured hillsides for edible plants just to survive between harvests. The country had no natural resources, no oil, no minerals worth exporting. Three-quarters of its industrial capacity had been destroyed in the Korean War and stayed in North Korea anyway. Foreign aid kept the population from starving. 30 years later, South Korea hosted the Olympics, showcasing gleaming skyscrapers, cutting-edge technology, and a confident middle class. By 2023, it's the world's 13th largest economy, home to Samsung, Hyundai, LG, brands that dominate global markets. This wasn't gradual improvement over centuries. This was a single generation going from subsistence farming to building semiconductors. And here's what nobody tells you. The strategy that made it happen violated every rule Western economists were teaching at the time. The transformation has a name, the miracle on the Han River. But miracles don't usually involve deliberate planning, government intervention, and massive foreign debt. So what actually happened? How does a nation with every disadvantage imaginable become an economic powerhouse in 30 years? Start with 1961. A military general named Park Chung-hee seized power in a coup. He wasn't interested in democracy or human rights. He was obsessed with one thing: eliminating the grinding poverty that made South Korea look pathetic next to rapidly industrializing North Korea. That comparison terrified him. North Korea was winning the economic race in the 1950s. If that continued, it would give credibility to Pyongyang's claim to represent progress and prosperity for all Koreans. Park's legitimacy depended on delivering economic results. So, he did something radical. He launched the first 5-year plan in 1962, setting explicit targets for industrial development, export growth, and infrastructure. Western economists thought this was insane. Central planning had failed everywhere it was tried. Markets, not governments, should allocate resources. But Park didn't care about economic theory. He cared about results. And the results were staggering. Between 1962 and 1982, exports grew at an average of 30% per year, with peaks exceeding 50%. Annual export value jumped from $55 million in 1962 to $27 billion in 1982. The ratio of exports to GNP went from about 1% in the 1950s to over 30% by the late 1970s. Here's the part that challenges everything you think you know about development. South Korea didn't follow the free market playbook. The government picked winners. It targeted specific industries, electronics, steel, shipbuilding, automobiles, and poured resources into making them globally competitive. It created massive conglomerates called chaebols, Samsung, Hyundai, LG, and gave them preferential loans, tax breaks, and government contracts on the condition they met export targets. If they failed to deliver, support was withdrawn. This created a brutal incentive structure: succeed in global markets or die. No coddling, no protecting inefficient industries behind tariff walls. You either became world-class or you disappeared. The education investment was equally strategic and equally ruthless. Despite being desperately poor, South Korea achieved the highest school enrollment rate of any nation at comparable income levels by 1961. Parents made enormous sacrifices to educate their children because they understood education was the only path out of poverty. The government capitalized on this cultural obsession, shifting much of the cost onto families while building an impressive education system with modest expenditures. By the time South Korea's 1960s industrial takeoff began, it had a better educated workforce than most other nations when they started their economic upturns, including China, Vietnam, Thailand, and India. But education alone doesn't explain it. Plenty of countries have educated populations and remain poor. South Korea did something else. It borrowed massively from abroad to finance industrialization. By 1985, foreign debt totaled $46.8 billion, making South Korea the fourth largest third-world debtor. This was risky. Debt-fueled growth can lead to catastrophic collapse if investments don't pay off. But South Korean planners weren't gambling. They were investing borrowed money exclusively in productive capacity, factories, equipment, technology, infrastructure that would generate export earnings to repay the debt. The strategy worked because the debt financed growth, not consumption. The political context matters too. Park's authoritarian government suppressed labor unions, imposed poor working conditions, and demanded sacrifice from workers. Long hours became the norm. Stress and work-life imbalance defined the era. The benefits of growth weren't equally distributed. Critics rightly argue the human costs were severe, but Park's regime delivered what it promised: economic transformation. Per capita income went from less than $100 in the 1950s to over $1,500 by Park's assassination in 1979. Life was still difficult, but definitively improving. The Sejmal movement, starting in the 1970s, extended development to rural areas that industrialization had left behind. Under the slogan "Diligence, Self-Help, and Cooperation," the government gave 300 bags of cement to each of 35,000 villages on condition it be used for community purposes, irrigation systems, roads, sanitation. This wasn't charity. It was mobilizing the population toward shared goals while maintaining productivity in agriculture as labor shifted to cities. Here's the twist that makes South Korea's story so valuable. The strategy was utterly unsuited to replication. It required specific historical conditions, Cold War geopolitics that made the U.S. willing to support a frontline anti-communist state, access to Japanese capital and technology transfers, cultural factors like Confucian values, emphasizing education and hierarchy, and timing that allowed South Korea to ride the wave of expanding global trade in the 1960s and 70s. Countries trying to copy this model today face a different world. Global markets are saturated, supply chains are established, the easy gains from exporting low-cost manufactured goods are gone. Yet the core lessons remain relevant. First, economic development requires productive investment, not consumption or speculation. Second, education and human capital matter more than natural resources. Third, export orientation forces competitiveness. You can't hide behind tariffs and subsidies if you're competing in global markets. Fourth, government intervention can work if tied to performance metrics and ruthlessly enforced. And fifth, rapid development demands sacrifice, often distributed unequally, raising difficult questions about whose sacrifice and for whose benefit. The 1997 Asian financial crisis tested whether South Korea's growth was sustainable or a house of cards. Corporate debt had reached dangerous levels. Chaebols had diversified recklessly, accumulating massive liabilities. When the crisis hit, South Korea needed an international rescue package. But unlike other countries that collapsed, South Korea forced chaebols to focus on core businesses, reduced debt, and reformed labor markets for flexibility. The economy recovered with rapid growth in 1999-2000. By 2006, per capita income hit $20,000. In 2004, South Korea joined the trillion-dollar GDP club. Today, young South Koreans face a different reality. Despite material prosperity, surveys show 89% of young women and 82% of young men believe people born into poverty can never compete with those born into wealth. The rapid development that lifted the nation created its own inequalities, rigidities, and social costs. Working hours remain among the longest in OECD countries. Quality of life lags some developed nations, despite economic metrics suggesting wealth. The chaebol system that drove growth now concentrates power and stifles competition. Success created new challenges. But zoom out to 1960 and the transformation remains astonishing. A nation with per capita income of $79, poorer than the poorest countries today, became a global technology leader, cultural powerhouse, and high-income economy within a single lifetime. Parents who scraped hillsides for edible plants saw their children become engineers building smartphones. That's not a miracle. That's what happens when a nation prioritizes productive investment, education, export competitiveness, and long-term thinking over short-term consumption and political expediency. South Korea didn't get lucky. It made brutally difficult choices, sacrificed enormously, and executed relentlessly. The price was high, the results were undeniable, and the lesson for every developing nation is both inspiring and terrifying. Transformation is possible, but it demands more than most societies are willing to give.